Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master, and today we're talking about Bumblebee. But before we get into that, smash that like button, make sure you're subscribed, and leave us a comment. That helps us out with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love hearing from you guys. We've got an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So thank you so much for being here. So, all that said, let's dive in. So, if you follow the podcast, you already know we went to BotCon on Father's Day where we met Dan Gilvazan, who is perhaps best known for being the voice of Bumblebee on the 1980s Transformers animated series. In fact, the channel art that I'm using for today's video is a photo that we took that day of Dan hanging out with my wife, Rachel. Her favorite Transformer is Bumblebee, and meeting Dan was the highlight of her birthday this year because we went on Father's Day. Not many guests were there, which also meant we got to hang out with the voice actors all afternoon. And all that time meant that we got to talk about our RPG far more at this convention than any other convention we've ever gone to. As such, I'm going to be posting short videos every day for a little while. The downside of which is that they're all going to be fairly brief, and there's not going to be as much going on in terms of plot. But the upside is how many of these there are. So hopefully, in the end, it will all kind of even out. So that said, I got to tell Dan about our role playing game and that in our game world, the war between the Autobots and Decepticons had finally ended. Megatron and Galvatron coexisted, which is a long story involving time travel, and the two of them were ultimately defeated. And the leader of the Decepticons then at that time was Scorponok, who was actually an organic being named Zarek. And Zarek surrendered. So the war finally came to an end. I told Dan that for some characters, I figured out what they would do, like Starscream hosting a political podcast where he screams into a microphone all day about how Zarek was an outsider who had no authority to surrender, and the Decepticons had gotten screwed over by the terms of the surrender. So Starscream wants his fellow Decepticons to rise up with him as the leader, of course. And by the way, Dan seemed to really get a kick out of that. He loved the idea of Starscream as a podcaster. I also said that I had Optimus Prime go to Washington, where he serves on a sort of round table that advises the president, and that other members of that round table include some of Dan's other characters, like Dargon, leader of the heroic Sectars, and Questar, leader of the heroic Dino Riders. And Dan seemed to get a kick out of that too. Anyways, so I told him I'd figured out what to do with all these other characters, but that I had no idea what to do with Bumblebee. So I said if anyone would know what Bumblebee would do after the war, it would be the man himself. So at first, Dan said, in his Bumblebee voice, no less, that this war really did a number on his paint job. So he wanted Wheeljack and Ratchet to hammer out every dent and fix every scratch. And then he wanted a fresh yellow paint job and some new chrome work done. Dan smiled and he said he wanted to be showroom fresh. I laughed and said, that's cool. And we would for sure put that in the game. But then I went on to add that I'd hoped he would have more of an idea as to what Bumblebee's occupation would be. So Dan sort of lit up and nodded, understanding where I was coming from, and he didn't really seem to have to think about it. He knew right away. He said he wants Bumblebee to be a camp counselor. And that answer sort of took me off guard for a second. So I just said something like, really? And Dan nodded with confidence, saying, "Oh, yeah, definitely. Bumblebee wants to help kids. So he would want to be in a situation where kids could come to him with their problems and he could help them out." And I gotta say, that's the most Bumblebee thing I've ever heard. So I nodded and I said, "That is a great answer, man." And Dan nodded and thanked me. I asked if there was anything else he wanted me to add to our continuity. And to put it in a nutshell, really, it would basically be the plot from Meatballs, just trading out the Bill Murray character with everybody's favorite little yellow Volkswagen bug. Something else we talked about, which I thought was cool, was I asked Dan to settle an old argument that I've had with some other fans. So I asked him, "How old do you think Bumblebee is in human years?" And again, Dan was really quick to respond. And he said, 22, again, with confidence. And I said, "Really?" And Dan said, "Yeah. In my mind, B was always 22 years old, but he doesn't understand Earth, and sometimes he acts like he's 13. Then Dan mentioned an old Bumblebee quote where Spike says something about how they're going to get out of this by the skin of their teeth. And Bumblebee says, "I didn't know human teeth had skin." I sort of nodded and I told him that I always figured Bumblebee was young and that that's why he and Spike hung out. Dan nodded and said, "Oh, yeah, definitely." And I mentioned to him that I'd met a lot of fans over the years who actually thought of Bumblebee as being much older. And I mentioned that the tech specs on the back of the box said that Bumblebee idolizes the bigger Autobots like Optimus Prime and Prowl and strives to be accepted. And to me, saying that he idolized them implied that he was young, but they were adults. And Dan agreed. I said I always thought of Bumblebee as being about 17, which ironically was the average of the two ages that Dan gave, a 22-year-old who sometimes acts like a 13-year-old. Anyways, so all that together made me love his summer camp idea. And on the drive home, I thought of something else, something that sadly I didn't say to Dan that day, but we can think of it as the epilogue. And that is that this summer camp should be close to where the old Autobot volcano was located, close to the ocean. I used to have a coloring book as a kid called Bumblebee's Dangerous Mission, and in it, they mentioned that Bumblebee had telescopic vision because back in 1984, almost all the Transformers had one superpower. Skywarp had teleportation, Mirage had invisibility, Ironhide had Omniarm, Hound had illusions, and according to ancillary media, Bumblebee had telescopic vision. Power, by the way, we see several characters demonstrate in the Transformers the movie in 1986. Anyway, so I thought it'd be cool if at the end of each day of camp, Bumblebee was looking out over the ocean. But what he's actually doing is standing watch. In the 1980s Transformers animated series, there was a Decepticon starship which had crashed in the Pacific Ocean, not too awful far away from the Autobots' volcanic headquarters. So I thought it would be really cool if Bumblebee would stare out at the ocean at night, waiting on that purple tower to rise up out of the sea and its door drop open so some Decepticons can fly out and cause some crisis that only the Autobots can deal with. But it hasn't happened yet. But nonetheless, I think it's an interesting theme for the game that you can take the soldier out of the war, but you can't fully take the war out of the soldier. So, yes, Bumblebee is absolutely there to help human kids, but also watches the sea each night, waiting. Anyways, we loved the idea of Bumblebee at camp, and we hope that you do too. If so, as always, we would love it if you took a quick moment of your time to smash that like button, check to make sure you're still subscribed, and leave us a comment. And from all of us here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure. Bye.